Joining me now in the Cypher Brief studio is Bob McNally. He is at the Abu Dhabi International Petroleum Exhibition Conference, which of course is the world's largest energy exhibition conference. And Bob, you are really a prominent energy expert in your own right, but you also served as Senior Director for International Energy on the National Security Council and a Special Assistant to the President on the National Economic Council. I really want to ask you kind of what's the buzz from the conference there this year? It looks like a very busy floor behind you.
It sure is, Suzanne, and thank you for having me. No, this is the biggest and the best convening conference really here in Abu Dhabi for the global energy industry, the equipment manufacturers, the investors, the policymakers. We're into day 3. It'll go through tomorrow. I spoke today on sort of what Trump's second term has meant for energy policy so far. So it's been a great conference. Look, the buzz here is, if you will, a transition in the transition. You know, until the last, and for the last few years or so, the dominant narrative in energy was peak demand. Oil demand's going to peak by 2030. Gas demand's going to peak by 2030. The world is basically going to run on Chinese electric vehicles and solar and wind. And oil and even gas are yesterday's fuel. That's over with now. The animal spirits are returning to the hydrocarbon sector. Estimates of demand are going up and up. Just today, the International Energy Agency announced that it will be reviving a scenario where demand continues to rise into the future. So there's excitement. Even companies that had been at the forefront of renewables and transition are now excited about new big oil and gas discoveries. So there's a sense that the world is coming back to realize we need oil, we need gas, in addition to renewables and nuclear and other things. So that is number one. Number two, everyone's talking about AI and data center demands and the all of a sudden interesting electricity markets around the world and how much of it is real and which will be the big winners and losers from the sort of data center phenomenon, which in some ways, Suzanne, is sort of replacing decarbonization as the interesting new theme, the new buzz in the energy area.
Excellent. You mentioned that you were speaking there at that conference, Bob, on Trump's second term, on sort of the energy policy that we've seen come out of the White House National Security Council so far. What is the sort of big takeaway for those who couldn't be there in person?
Yeah, you know, in some ways, I think what we're seeing with President Trump is a amplification, a vivid, almost theatrical amplification of trends that have already been underway for many years, if not decades. Look, the Cold War, Washington consensus is breaking down. Free trade, welcoming China into the global economic system, hard money, alliances that we knew back in the day, rules-based order. That's been cracking and creaking, and it's disintegrating even faster. Number one. Number two, we've seen the president gather more power in our country, in the United States, at the expense of Congress. The president's power is growing and Congress is ceding power, and that's certainly the case here. And then third, again, it's not just with President Trump, but we've seen this movement away from this sort of decarbonize at all costs to more of a pragmatic, all of the above approach to energy, where the federal government's not going to try and hinder oil and gas development, stop pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're seeing with President Trump, I think, is very much a continuation and an amplification of those trends.
Bob, given that you're there in Abu Dhabi, how do you view the role of the Gulf region itself, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, in shaping global energy stability, let's say over the next decade, beyond just oil supply, but in those renewables that you talked about, the hydrogen, carbon markets, infrastructure?
Well, the biggest role they play is in the old fuels, oil. Look, one thing we know about oil, and I've written a book about this, the history, it is prone to wild price volatility, unacceptable price volatility for both producers and consumers. And the only cure we've found in 170 years is to have a swing producer, adjust supply to prevent that price stability. The United States, Suzanne, was that swing producer from 1932 to 1972. OPEC, really led by Gulf producers, Saudi Arabia, UAE, They took over from the United States. Even President Trump learned to love OPEC in 2020 when he begged OPEC to cut production and save the U.S. shale industry from dying when oil prices had fallen during COVID to $20 a barrel. So what we're sort of learning again is that stability is the most important thing in oil. The Gulf region, especially Saudi Arabia and UAE, as the main swing producers, are the most important countries for providing that stability. And even though demand's not going to peak and the world's going to need more oil in the future, we're still going to have surpluses. We're still going to have these imbalances between supply and demand, which we better hope that swing producer is successful at managing. Otherwise, nobody enjoys being on Space Mountain when it comes to crude prices.
Not when it comes to this. With the rise of sort of energy transition, climate policy, these new regulations that we're seeing, how do you see energy security really being redefined?
You know, it's going to be redefined in various ways. First of all, it'll be, as we look toward electrification and renewables and so forth, there's the concern about critical minerals, right? It's not that we're going to replace drilling with mining, but we're going to add mining to drilling. And that means we have to be concerned about countries in Africa, countries in Central America and South America that we maybe haven't paid too much attention to before from an energy perspective. We're going to have to be very wary of China's dominance over those rare earths, both the manufacturing, refining, and production of that equipment. And so it's a whole new aspect. But then there's something else, Suzanne. It's power markets, electricity markets. And it's not so much that the data centers are just going to swamp them. These markets have been getting tight and vulnerable for decades. We've been failing to invest in the grid, failing to invest in enough generation. Now the data centers come along and just sort of tip us over to where, you know, when you don't have enough electricity, there's no real storage. It just goes out. And so we're going to have to think about not only as a cyber threat, but just having enough capacity to meet electricity load, especially in parts of the world where it gets very hot. Or it gets very cold, and it's that. And so that area of energy is also going to rise in the future. Look, we just had an election in the state of New Jersey. Electricity prices are up 22% in a year in that state. That's a sign of things to come all over the country.
You know, Bob, you said a couple of things about the critical minerals, national security, of course. When we think about critical minerals as well, is that such a big focus for us here at the Cipher Brief. I'm wondering how you see this intersection of energy security and national security and how that should be perhaps playing more into the policy of the current administration when you talk about places like Africa, about Latin America, South America, et cetera.
Well, to their credit, I think this administration is not blind to the pressing energy security challenges coming from the rise of data centers, the importance of critical minerals, and the importance of not becoming dependent on China for that. Let's just remember, going back to 2010, China's strategy was to move first, dominate the supply lines for new energy in both transportation, electric vehicles, and power, renewables, and so forth. And they largely achieved that goal in terms of dominating those sectors. Well, if there's one thing, Suzanne, that Democrats and Republicans by and large agree on, is we would rather decarbonize slowly with our own kit or our allies' kit with secure supply lines, working with countries that are not adversaries, than do it on the China Dream Plan, where it may happen faster, but we surrender our auto sector, our energy security to the whims of China. We're just not willing to do that. So, you know, there's a lot of polarization these days, a lot of debates, but I think one area perhaps of underappreciated bipartisan consensus is that we're not going to let China dominate these critical sectors. I think that the Trump administration understands that. I think even my friends in the Democratic Party, serious energy security thinkers in the Democratic Party, I think get that as well. And so it's one area of rare bipartisan consensus. I'm pretty optimistic that we'll manage that well in the coming years.
We're hoping we can have a lot more of that bipartisan consensus on a lot of these issues. But I really want to ask you before I let you go there, in your view, what do you think the greatest black swan risk is to global energy markets over, say, the next 2 to 5 years?
I'm going to give you a happy black swan and a sad black swan, a bad side. The happy one would be, you know, it's not impossible to contemplate regime change in Caracas or even Tehran. Iran has been set back, and its population loathes the regime as much as everybody else does. And it's not impossible to think about, in that time frame, Iran having a regime which is more like its people. Can you imagine if investors get back into Iran with its oil and gas reserves, mature fields with infrastructure right there? I mean, that could be a happy supply boost that could help keep oil prices lower for longer. Caracas, perhaps even more pertinent now with what's happening there. Again, a country that's been sort of out of alignment with its historical constellation with the United States in recent years. And we see the Trump administration seems determined to either co-opt or replace this regime, and that'll have many, I would say, consequences. Some of them having to do with drugs and immigration, but energy as well. And again, another country that were its regime to become, let's say, to have an improvement, an upgrade, you could see investment in energy supply going up. So that would be my sort of optimistic black swan. The pessimistic one is something I worried about a lot in the White House. I think the biggest source of vulnerability, not only in energy, but to our whole economy globally, is a risk of a repeat Iranian attack on critical Saudi energy infrastructure, specifically the Abqaiq stabilization plant, which the Iranians attacked in September of 2019. It caused the largest open in crude oil markets in terms of prices ever. In my view, if there's 1 square mile on planet Earth that we cannot afford to lose, it's irreplaceable. I think it's that stabilization plant. So I hope Iran is set back, and we, even with the fighting with Israel this summer, we did not see energy infrastructure implicated. I'm more worried about fixed infrastructure like that than I am the Strait of Hormuz. We will eventually reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But for me, it's critical Gulf energy infrastructure remains the thing that worries me the most and should keep national security planners up at night.
Bob McNally, fantastic. I like the happy plan. I'm a little worried about the not so happy black swan, but thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to get your insights on how this intersection of energy and national security comes together. Joining us there from the Abu Dhabi International Petroleum Exhibition and Conference. Thank you so much, Bob. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Suzanne.